Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, A Conversation on Grief and Loss, hosted by Compassion and Choices. My name is Tom Quash, and I'm the Chief Marketing and Program Officer at Compassion and Choices. But before we begin, 3 items that you'll want to take note of. First, today's webinar is being recorded and will be made available to you at the Compassion and Choices website about a week from today. Secondly, everyone is in view mode. That means audio and video functions have been disabled. And lastly, towards the end of today's webinar, we'll have a question and answer segment that you will be able to participate in. Just find the Q&A button near the bottom of your screen, and at any point during today's webinar, you can submit your questions. If you'd like to do so anonymously, you'll be able to look at the option to do so. And we'll get to as many questions as possible today. Now let's begin. Grief and loss. Those are terms and experiences that are not foreign to most of us. At any point in our lives, all of us, possibly, have experienced grief and loss, perhaps both. But today, both grief and loss seem more prevalent within the pandemic environment that we're in. Our presenter, Robert Drake, will take us through a conversation on such grief and loss. Robert Drake is the Medical Outreach Manager here at Compassion and Choices, where he educates healthcare professionals, hospices, and hospital systems on dignified end-of-life option and care. Robert is an ordained interfaith clergy, an experienced hospice chaplain, bereavement counselor, and certified home funeral guide. Robert has a Master of Science degree in the philosophy of conflict and a Master of Divinity from San Francisco Theological Seminary. He has spoken internationally on spiritual care at end of life. Although trained in and respected many world religions, as a theologian, Robert considers himself more spiritual than religious. Please join me in welcoming Robert Drake.
Hi, everyone, and welcome. Sorry. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to just acknowledge what we're all going through together and to ask that we hold a moment of silence for those who are suffering most, those dying, those sick, those unable to get to their or be with their sick and their loved ones. Today's topic is a complex one. We must necessarily leave out a lot of important points. We'll go over some characteristics of grief, loss, and healing. I'd like to read a poem by Mary Oliver. To live in this world, you must be able to do 3 things. To love what is mortal, to hold it against your bones, knowing your own life depends on it, and when the time comes, to let it go, to let it go. I'm suggesting at the outset that without active grieving, we can't fully heal from our losses. Grief itself is not healing. Grief is suffering. Suffering is not necessarily grieving, and grief is a response to loss. Grief comes from the experience of loss, and loss is unavoidable because we are mortal, and entropy or dissolution is a law of the universe. But loss is a break in our experience of a whole and unified world, and can be a reaction to all kinds of things that are important to us. We grieve our losses because they represent loss of hope for our vision of what life should be. The experience of loss brings about our suffering. We suffer if we experience a trauma or are violated, if we lose trust in someone or a system, if we lose trust in the sanctity and safety of our surroundings or our world. Any understanding of grief must begin with understanding loss, and that must begin with understanding attachment. The experience of loss is the origin of grief. When we lose what we love, as we must, as finite beings, we will grieve. The theologian and pastoral counselor and a mentor, Herbert Anderson, said the origin of grief depends on the twin realities of attachment and finitude. And attachment is inevitable. Although we don't consciously remember it, our time as human beings involves a longing to capture the mystical unity of our infancy in the womb. Our journey in this life is a never-ending struggle with the inescapable reality that what we love will perish. The emotions we experience in grief after a significant loss are ordinary ones that become clustered together in the grief response, an intense emotional complex. And every person's grief complex and emotional patterns are unique. Here's a short list of what we might experience. My guess is that all of us here have experienced all of these at some time, and many of these currently. Look familiar? Grief is not linear. It's just not that neat, and grieving people will judge themselves or others if they don't conform, and probably they won't conform to any stage progression. There are various stage theories of grief, originating with Kubler-Ross, the grief stage theory that was specifically meant to describe the grief journey of terminally ill patients as they coped with their own terminal diagnosis before they died. And it was quickly extrapolated to describe a roadmap we all follow when we are grieving. It was not meant to be understood that way. Of types of losses, the normally understood types, we understand these common forms, and we will talk about all of these: material loss, relationship, intrapsychic, functional, loss of roles, and loss of involvement in a system that we've come to count on. Material loss is that of a physical object or familiar surroundings that we have become attached to and comfortable with. Relationship loss involves the loss of normal relatedness modes we're used to experiencing, enjoying, or even hating with a loved one or group. My own parents were each other's greatest adversaries, yet when Mom died, Dad followed her within 6 months. Intrapsychic loss describes loss of key parts of our psyche, how we see ourselves in the world, our understanding of where we fit in our community or in our family. As Professor Anderson says, this is a decidedly inner experience. Examples of functional loss might be loss of the ability to drive your car, having a hysterectomy or vasectomy, losing hearing or sight, losing mobility, the ability to go bowling or garden or do all the things that make life worth living. Role loss can be profoundly disorienting, like loss of a job. The loss of a child means not only the loss of the child, but also the loss of the parenting role, something profoundly gratifying or all-encompassing even. The disappearance of accustomed functions or their performance can cause loss of the system itself and to the person. This in turn generates feelings of guilt and suffering. We're experiencing systemic loss on a grand global scale right now, with no understanding of when or even if things might go back to some kind of normalcy. Of the types of grief that are commonly accepted, we don't really have time to go into all of these today. That could be another webinar, and if you have interest in doing that, contact me and we can see what we can do. But these are the normally accepted types. Anticipatory, normal or common, complicated, delayed, inhibited, disenfranchised. absent grief, and exaggerated grief. If we anticipate a loss, we feel grief. Hearing that a loved one has a terrible diagnosis or prognosis leads us to anticipate that loss and the suffering attendant with it. Notice of impending layoffs might do the same thing to us. When going through normal or common grief, people are able to function and continue with basic daily activities. While they may find that daily life is more difficult, they're still able to continue working and doing routine tasks. Normal grief includes emotional reactions like numbness, shock, disbelief, separation anxiety, feelings of yearning, visions of their loved one's death, and preoccupation with the loss, the death. Complicated grief is when you're completely overwhelmed with that grief. You're constantly thinking about the death, worrying about what could have been or might have been. This is fairly rare. About 7% of those suffering from a major loss will experience complicated grief, and this needs to be addressed with a clinical professional. One common experience among the bereaved is delayed grief. A person may not be in a position to fully experience the grief and sadness that are there, but it can surface later. If this happens when you're very young, you may not experience the grief until you're older. If you're using substances, or even if you're part of a social context such as being in war or being in a pandemic that interrupts and delays our grieving processes. Inhibited grief is when people avoid or escape their grief instead of experiencing their emotions. You might find that you're distracting yourself by spending a lot of time cleaning the house or keeping your mind busy all day on something. Disenfranchised grief is widespread and warrants its own discussion. This is a grief that's not socially accepted or even acknowledged. It's common that if you use your pet, other people might not see it as that important. Abortion might be untalked about, miscarriages, loss of the ability to procreate, loss of a job due to alcohol or drug use. Of absent grief, the APA defines this as a form of complicated grief in which a person shows no or only few signs of distress about the death of a loved one. This pattern of grief is thought to be an impaired response resulting from denial or avoidance of the emotional realities of the loss. You might find yourself saying, "I don't feel anything. What's wrong with me?" This too should be addressed with clinical professional psychologists. Chronic and unremitting grief is typically associated with sudden, unexpected, and traumatic death, like COVID-19, imagine, or a terrible accident or violent crime. The loss of children and the relative closeness of the bereaved person to the deceased cause this. Moral injury, grief from moral injury. An example of this might be, for instance, the high suicide rate of veterans. 20% of all US suicides are veterans because soldiers' understanding about the way the world works or what they thought humanity should be or how humanity should act or how they should act is now in question. That belief was shaken. Some of us are experiencing moral injury now with the pandemic. Examples: not enough PPE for healthcare workers, not enough testing. That's not the way many of us think things are supposed to work, and it shakes our confidence in our social systems. Common grieving experiences may include numbness, emptiness, loneliness, fear, and anxiety to the point of fearing for one's very survival, or fear of the future with no hope, no narrative that we can want to live into. Grief suffering tends to spiral up and down, now all-encompassing, now receding. Grieving is unpredictable, and although it may go into remission, it can be a process that never ends. This is because our emotional and spiritual attachment to others, they don't just go away. We loved them. We needed them. You can't expect them to just go away. It's unsettling, and it's difficult to determine when the primary work of grieving is done. One moment we're fine, and the next we're weeping or we're furious. Grieving is selfish. It's self-oriented. It needs to be selfish, even if it's grief for others' suffering. The experience of grief is one's own, and no one can tell me or you how you ought to grieve, what you ought to be feeling. And it will endure, even or especially if it's sublimated. The grieving process doesn't conform to what society thinks it should be. Even so-called simple or common grief is complex. Herbert Anderson said, grieving is an intentional act moving toward receding goals. We can postpone the work necessary to truly grieve, but we can't delay the grief. When we postpone our grieving, because it's not convenient or comfortable, our bodies will store it. We can postpone the work necessary to truly grieve, but we cannot delay the grief. The grief will be there, it will remain, though sublimated, and our bodies will store it. And the cost for grief storage is tremendous. And it can lead to chronic or even acute health issues. For many years, I practiced therapeutic body work with survivors of sexual, physical, and even ritual abuse. And I can tell you that grief and trauma don't just go away. It gets stored, and a later insult can trigger relapse or relive trauma, triggering a crisis. So, how shall we grieve? The aim of healthy grieving is resolution and synthesis. It's important to retain the meaning of the love for what has been lost and create a new future narrative of hope and survivability. Grief has been coming to be seen as pathological. It is not pathological. It could be that this pandemic will normalize grief, even as we are forced to delay the active mourning process. The work of grieving involves both remembering and hoping. We continue to love the person or dream now dead, but if we can, we begin opening a new relationship through memory and retelling of our stories. Another relationship can be born. The tasks of mourning. The psychologist J.W. Warden created a stage-based model for coping with the death of a loved one. He divided the bereavement process into 4 tasks. Accept the reality of the loss. Work through the pain of the grief. Adjust to a life without the deceased in it. And maintain a connection to the deceased while moving on with your life. In the time of the pandemic, we see we don't have the opportunity for closure. We don't have the opportunities to mourn publicly, to have open funerals. We may be completely isolated, but for a telephone and video, we're afraid, we feel powerless, and we can even feel some type of moral injury from this. Current physical distancing is driving a wedge into our traditional moments of connection. The psychologist Sherry Cormier, who focuses on grief training, says, quote, "One of the most time-tested ways of coping with grief is to practice social connection, to be with other mourners. Now we may be having to cope with grief alone, socially isolated, where we don't get the physical comfort we need from friends and family. With strict isolation measures in place in most hospitals and long-term care facilities, skilled nursing facilities, people are missing out on those final farewells. And we need to create new systems for creating ritual and processing our grief and joining together. Prolonged grief disorder is something that we haven't talked about yet today. It's a new ICD-11 disorder, and it defines prolonged grief as lasting at least 6 months without treatment. Prolonged grief increases the risk of substance abuse, sleep disorders, impaired immune functioning, and suicidal thinking. If you are experiencing this, please seek professional clinical support. This is a form of complex grief. The work of grieving can be healthy and productive. Reconciliation through active grieving can even become a spirituality in its own sense. The process of reuniting oneself in our vulnerability with our place in the larger narrative, the narrative of community, or even the narrative of our relationship with the divine. It can be healthy and productive if nurtured and understood. It can restore and reunite parts of our story with parts of ourselves. The reconciliation process found through active grieving with ritual support is not about forgetting. It's about restoring and reuniting parts of our story with parts of ourselves. Friend and healer. Grief can serve as a friend and healer if we mourn what we have lost, if we remember what is important, if we affirm what was meaningful, and preserve the valuable memories while we also let the past become the past. Grief reminds us that we can't flee the past just because it is gone, nor can we undo it, but it can be restorative. I want to read a poem that Augustine wrote in his Confessions. He here is describing his reaction to his grief over the death of a dear friend. The tears streamed down, and I let them flow as freely as they would, making of them a pillow for my heart. On them it rested. So how then shall we mourn? Do it in your own way. Don't let anyone tell you how you should grieve. Your reactions will be shaped by the relationship you had, your personality style, the support or lack of support that you're receiving. It's going to be different for everyone. Trust your own process. Mourn the death or the thing, whatever it is, whether it's a person, it's a way of life, it's a job. You may cry, you may not. It's not predictable, and it's not linear. Grieve actively. Share your grief unashamedly, and don't apologize. Tell your story to someone as fully as possible. Acknowledge your suffering. A new story cannot be created until the old story is told. And remember that you are never alone in your grief. The whole universe aches with you. So, the goals of grieving, we must face the reality of the loss as fully as possible, express our emotions that are connected with the loss, create cherishable memories, that help us to be at peace. And if you are or were a person of faith, work on reconstructing your faith stance, relearning a faith stance. The human task is to love, knowing that we will eventually lose what we love, because attachment and finitude are unavoidable and necessary dimensions of human life. There will be loss and there will be grief. Look for practical support. There are so many ways. Practical support for grief work are manifold. Create meaningful ritual. Find a time every day to reflect on the love that was there, the importance, the beautiful memories that were there, and on the loss itself, and on your feelings. Ask for practical assistance. This may be clergy, it may be support groups, it may be a counselor, it may be a trusted friend, but talk about it. Keep your body, exercise. I was going to say, be in your body. That's where it lives, and although it may be a scary place, that is the way through, and be patient with yourself. And finally, and we were never, or very seldom taught to do this, practice forgiveness. Actually practice forgiveness, I want to suggest to you as a powerful tool. Forgiving self, forgiving God, forgiving the people that have died or let you down in some way, forgiving yourself. In this time of so much suffering around us, we're going to be, and many of us in our work are with others who are grieving. The important things is in being present, and sometimes just the mere presence, unadulterated, attentive, caring presence is the best thing that we can offer those who are suffering. In pastoral care, there's something called the ministry of caring presence, where we sit next to the person energetically, if not in person, and just hold them, maybe without talking. Silence is a healer too. Remember too that the first year of bereavement is the most difficult one, because the bereaved person is experiencing a whole year of first times without the presence of the person that she lost, or the way of life that she lost. Accept mood swings. Don't try to explain things away. Use concrete language that's understandable. Give help. Help with making meals, something practical. At the end of the day, life is suffering, but it is also possibility. Hold and honor your losses, but live the life that you have. Take your grief into the world and hold it there, loving, feeling, healing, and do this every day. I want to leave plenty of time for Q&A and discussion, but before I leave you, I want you to know that you are not alone. Utilize your support systems and get professional help if you're suffering sooner than later. If you want grief or funeral resources, you can email me at rdrake@compassionandchoices.org. I can make available resources for that. So before I turn it back over to Tom, I want to say thank you. May the spirit of love hold you and keep you safe. And Tom.
Thank you, Robert, for that very powerful presentation. Words that we can all learn from, so we all, I'm sure, appreciate that. We do have a few questions that I want to share with everyone. First from Kim MW, my spouse is newly deceased. I can integrate our humor and interest, but our joint participation in outdoor activities is where the joy lay. Even a sunny day is painful for me. How do I imagine that without her?
It's going to take time. What you're experiencing, it's real. It's not going to just go away. And I wouldn't want to suggest that. You will be reminded every time, as you say, you go into the sun and you're standing alone in the sun instead of with your partner. So first of all, feel the sun on your face. Feel what you're feeling. And then maybe journal, talk to people, but don't please try to think that or imagine that you should be feeling something different than what you're doing. And maybe something practical like, you know, when we're through the pandemic and the social isolation, finding someone to walk with, a group with, even bereaved people have, people that have lost their partners have groups, hiking groups, for instance. So first I would encourage you to feel what you're feeling, know that there's nothing abnormal about it, and allow the space and flexibility to go up and down. And by the way, don't worry about my emotions. I'm a hospice chaplain and I'm used to this. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Our next question. How can people grieve their own way when there are so many factors you describe as complicated and in need of professional help? It seems there can't be both. Perhaps the person grieving is the person who should decide what is complicated and hurting their recovery. What are your thoughts?
I would say again, your grieving process and your solutions, your palliative and healing measures will be unique to you. Maybe professional support isn't the thing that you need at this time. But I would just say, consider it. The APA, the American Psychological Association, is now being allowed to have psychologists be reimbursed for audiovisual psychotherapy sessions. But again, don't judge yourself. I wouldn't second guess yourself. Stay present to what you're feeling and the options. Listen, but don't be told.
Great. Thank you again. Next question. Is it not also true that the second year can be worse because the shock is lessened and the reality of the loss has set in?
Yes. Again, grief is not linear. So yes, it's true that for many people, the first year is the toughest. But if we have been avoiding, for a variety of reasons, usually really good reasons, the experiencing of the feelings, it can come out at any given time. It may get worse in the second and worse again, come back hard on the fifth year, depending on what is going on in your life. Yes, it's not linear.
Great, thank you. How can we walk alongside the grieving virtually? We will have time for a traditional memorial, but how can we reach out virtually and authentically?
You know, there's so much that can be done powerfully through the medium that we're using right now. On this particular video, we can't see your faces, and that's a limitation, a necessary limitation, but you can reach out. We can reach out to people. I had a birthday party with a 35th birthday party with my youngest daughter a couple nights ago. There were 25 people on. It was powerful. It was wonderful. A private Zoom or Google chat or even telephone call can be powerful. FaceTime. But we need to get used to it. And that will take time. There are palliative care organizations that are doing most of their work, even spiritual care and social work via Zoom. And there's a way in which a relationship can be made even more intimately, because they're coming into your home in a significant way. They're sitting with you. Right now, you are sitting in my dining room with me. It can be useful. It can be powerful. But it may not be your answer. And there will be time, again, we're waiting. I was reading that the number of funerals in many parts of the country have tripled. This is a hard reality, but, and of course there has to be social distancing kept, et cetera, but there will be a time. There are necessary limits right now for most of us on our grieving. So it will come back harder, perhaps next year for many of us, and the year after. Thank you.
Thank you again, Robert. We have a few questions about anticipatory grief. Can you go into a little bit more detail about that?
Sure. If someone I loved was given a diagnosis, a really difficult, perhaps terminal diagnosis, I can anticipate, I will start moving forward in time. It now becomes part of my future narrative, and I will be moving forward in time and imagining that future reality and the loss, and I will be feeling the loss. And because I feel the loss of a person or a way of life or something that's important to me that I have loved, I will begin the process of grieving. This can sometimes make the actual event later on in time a little bit more mediated, moderated, because some of the grief response has already been processed, and some form of healing has already been processed. If I look forward to a time when I don't have vision, and I love art, and I love sailing, now I look forward to a time where I have less mobility, and I know that time will come, I can already start the process of anticipatory grieving. And perhaps that anticipatory grief, if processed, can lead me to measures that will help to ameliorate or lessen the impact at that time. Great question.
Great, thank you again. Can you talk about the anger of grief? Anger with the hospital, the drunk driver, the murderer, the suicide, the person who died, the government. Can you talk, can you address the anger associated with grief sometimes?
Yeah, I can, both personally and from the standpoint of personally watching family members in an ICU, for instance. The disbelief and anger go really hand in hand. And I can't relate how many times I have been in an ICU with a family, and a teenager, for instance, whose parent is in a coma, is just outraged and saying, no, this cannot be happening. Anger can also be a useful tool for supporting or even forcing change. We have good reason to be angry. We might be angry at our political system or the world economy or God or a family member who didn't take care of themselves. They went out and got infected when they may have known better. It's reasonable to be angry. We can be angry over our losses, and that is an important and powerful and normal grief response to loss. I would say honor it, listen to it, journal about it, talk to someone about it. And if you're judging yourself for it, good time to start practicing forgiveness. It will help lead you through the process and make the most out of that particular emotion. Thank you. Great question.
Thank you. Unfortunately, it looks like some of our participants have lost loved ones to COVID-19, and there seems to be this similar thread of loss. I'll read one of the questions. My husband died from COVID-19 in a nursing home on April 11th. I wasn't able to see him for weeks before that and only spoke sporadically on the phone. How do I deal with not being able to say goodbye or be with him when he passed?
I'm sorry for your loss and that experience. There's nothing that I can say that will take this suffering away. I can only say many of us are with you in your suffering. You are not alone. You feel alone. And what you suffer is the most incredible of insults to life as you believed it, I can imagine, as you believed it should be. You ought to have had the opportunity to say goodbye. You ought to have, and you didn't. So I would encourage you to create ritual, intentional ritual. Bring your husband into the room with you. Some native traditions have what are variously called different forms of death lodge. And you can actually create ritual and invite the spirit, and if you don't believe in spirit, the memory of your loved one into a circle with you, into connectivity and relationship with you. And so I would encourage you to create ritual, meaningful ritual, something that's meaningful to you. It may not be to others. I would encourage you to talk about it. And, you know, if your husband was in hospice for any period of that, time, hospice is required by Medicare to provide bereavement services for up to 15 months to family members. If you're not in hospice, then I would say there are a lot of talk to clergy, talk to counselors, talk to trusted friends, journal, listen to music that you listen to together, and allow yourself to cry, to grieve. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. I imagine that would be helpful for others in similar circumstances who pose similar questions. Do you have any special advice that you recommend for helping children and adolescents who have lost a parent when the other parent is grieving and unavailable?
Yeah, that's really tough. I think looking back over my clinical chaplaincy experience, especially in ICUs and the like, it's the children. That can be so hard. They're angry. They may not be in a place where they can understand what's going on. They don't have a fully formed, inclusive idea or sense of what the world is, but they know what they need. And what they needed is gone. And in this case, maybe the other major support person is not present because he or she, mom or dad, is grieving, or in avoidance, or drinking to numb the pain, or disappearing emotionally, in any number of ways, it's really hard with children. And I would encourage you to get professional clinical help, people who specialize, therapists who specialize in working with children, loss and grief. And be patient.
Great, thank you. Is it psychologically appropriate or mentally healthy to prepare letters or videos for your family and friends? Are there any studies or examples that shows how beneficial this can be to help the bereaved, short and long term?
Great question. I haven't seen any long-term studies, only anecdotal information that can be really useful, because you are, and we're seeing this in other ways with end-of-life choices, that the process of the conversation, like the Go Wish card game, to think about ways of the ways you want your life to end or not to end, that helps with advanced care directives. And by the way, the advanced care directive, which you can find on our website, a variety of things, even with dementia, are wonderful ways to engage your family, to not only let them know what you want, but to understand better yourself what you want. I recently had a conversation with my two daughters and said, if I get COVID and I am taken to the hospital, do not put me on a ventilator. And that was hard for them to accept. I have my reasons, clinical reasons, statistical reasons, protective reasons of the healthcare team. Those are my reasons. Those are not to, I don't want to translate those, but a video is super powerful. And especially if it comes to the time when you can't make the decisions for yourself, if you have a video that helps your children or your partner say, yes, this is what mom would have wanted, that can save an enormous amount of suffering and even trauma. So yes, I would say any of these ideas you can try, but the important thing is dialogue, is to be having these conversations. My experience as a hospice chaplain and palliative care chaplain tells me decidedly that we wait way too long to have these conversations until it's too late, because when things start going south, they start going south really fast. So have the conversations, have the dialogue. It will bring you closer, and them closer to you. And there may be denial and anger, etc., from the children, or from a spouse, or from parents. But maybe better now than later. Thank you. Great question.
Thank you. Next question. It seems like these days we are grieving loss of more than just a loved one or a job, but almost a whole way of life. What advice do you have for us who feel this way?
My advice for us, I include myself decidedly in this group, is to forgive ourselves our fears, forgive ourselves our not knowing, forgive ourselves our inadequacy. And the rug has been pulled out from under all of us, all over the planet. My hope is that this will cause some kind of sea change in the way we relate to each other, the way we relate to ourselves internally, the way we engage in life, the way we relate to our environment, nature, communication, relationship. And it's going to be hard. There's just no way around it. It's going to be hard. And it's going to be harder for some than others. So it's hard to tell someone to be patient. You know, it's not, I would never do that as a chaplain. But the truth is our system has been turned inside out. It will never be the same. And there could be something beautiful that comes out of it over time, not just within our families or within our work. I know my work organization has changed. I know people so much better now after these weeks of Zooming. And I'm grateful for that. But I haven't had to deal yet with the loss, the death of one of my colleagues. I'm grateful for that. Everything has changed. But there is, I'm a sailor, and I learned so much about life from sailing. And what I know is that the tide always returns. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I ask the next question, I see a lot of comments about the recording for today's webinar. I want to remind everyone that the recording will be available on the Compassionate Choices website about a week from today. Access the homepage, you'll be able to link there to obtain a recording from this presentation. And next question, Robert. What advice do you have for someone who is feeling relief, contentment, and doesn't feel they're grieving because they don't feel they are falling apart, and they wonder if they are doing something wrong?
I would advise them, again, to forgive themselves for not conforming to what, to the behavior or the feelings that they think they're supposed to. And this is natural. This is one of the forms of grief. It's delayed. For many people, it's delayed. And I would just say there's enough to worry about already. And enjoy. You know, I think it takes courage to experience joy, to allow ourselves to experience joy in times of suffering. But it's needed there more than ever. So go ahead and be the light for others. Go ahead and allow your joy to show appropriately, and be attentive to where it might not be appropriate. Thank you. Great question.
Thank you. I had a moderated grief response at the grave site and after my dad's death because I did anticipatory grief, which you spoke about earlier. Mm-hmm. My other family members could not understand and judged me in error. Can you please speak to withholding judgment for each griever?
Yeah. This is so common in families. So first of all, I wouldn't judge your family for it. It's normal reaction. Family systems are complex. Everyone deals with grief differently. And we can say that to them that, or we can hope that they would understand that you have dealt with some of this, had dealt with some of this before. That didn't mean you didn't feel the grief or the sorrow or the sadness or the loss, but that you felt it and you processed some of it. I would hope that they would be glad for that, but being glad for someone when I am in my own deep suffering, feeling the loss, the bereavement, that's a hard thing. And so we can't really ask them to be different any more than they maybe ought to ask you to be different. So again, this comes back to the practice of forgiveness of self and others. Thank you. Sorry you have to go through that.
Thank you. And we're getting close to the hour, so our final question is, can you recommend some resources for those of us who are grieving and help us understand what we're going through?
Yes, I would say I think we need to post. You can look to American Psychological Association. You can Google grief. There, the grief recovery method is really powerful. It's in the grief recovery handbook. You can get that. They've been around for 40 years. It's a really powerful tool. If you email me at rdrake@compassionandchoices.org, I can provide you with some resources, and we'll see if we can't get some of those resources up on our website. I frankly wouldn't be surprised. We have so many resources on our website that state by state even, that I wouldn't be surprised if we have a good amount of that already. But feel free to reach out to me, and I'll send you some materials, some resources. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. And I want to thank Robert, and I want to thank the participants for today's webinar. Again, you'll be able to get a recording in about a week from the Compassion and Choices website. You can also find other resources at our website, compassionandchoices.org. From there, you can link to a special page that includes end-of-life care planning resources and tools. Plus, we created a COVID-19 toolkit that we hope that you'll find valuable and useful. You can, again, access all of these resources directly from the homepage, compassionandchoices.org. Our next webinar is this Thursday, April 30th at 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific. Barbara Coombs-Lee will discuss what does it mean to finish strong. We also are developing our May webinar series, more to come within the next few weeks, and that schedule should be available in the next week, but we hope to see you again this Thursday. You can also access the archive of our previous webinars. Again, compassionandchoices.org will lead you to the list of upcoming webinars, plus the archive of those recorded webinars that we launched a few weeks ago. Want to remind you to find us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. We also have a YouTube channel and an Instagram page where you can stay connected to the Compassion and Choices community through the social media channels that you prefer to use. We hope to see you on social. Our organization is funded almost exclusively through individual donors like you, people who are concerned and care about the compassion and choice among end-of-life care and options. Accessing, and we hope that you'll make a donation of any size. Any size amount of the donation is important, and it allows us to continue doing the work that we are doing today and develop new resources for those who are interested in supporting end-of-life care resources and autonomy. You can make a donation easily online at compassionandchoices.org/donate, or look for the donate button at compassionandchoices.org. Again, thank you all for your participation today, for your questions, and thank you, Robert Drake, for your powerful presentation on this conversation on grief and loss. We hope to see you all this Thursday and in the near future on another webinar. Thank you.
Blessings of health and healing.